not long ago, I wrote a book called All at War about photography by German soldiers in the Second World War, in a subject in which I had really no interest at all, but until I came across it. The collection is made up of hundreds of thousands of photographs, some loose, some in albums, bought in Germany over the last 20 years by German agents and others for a private collector, a very affluent private collector, who asked me to look at them and to write about some of the sets of pictures, which I did, and I found them in some cases very interesting. 98% are simply, German war pictures are simply of crashed aircraft and abandoned tanks, and of not a great deal of interest to anyone. But I did find in this huge collection what you might describe as a number of artists, 4 or 5, maybe up to 10 artists. And what interested me was whether they were made artists by exposure to the war, or whether they had some innate qualities in them, or whether they had some previous teaching we knew nothing about. I never resolved these issues, but they were all sort of in contention as I wrote this book. A brief history of the war before, from a pictorial point of view. It started, the first war that had Second War characteristics was called the Little War. It was between Hungary and Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, in 1938, and it was a mechanized war. Now, at the beginning of 1939, 1940, 1941, it was assumed by journalists and writers like Curzio Malaparte, who was one of the great writers on the Second World War, that it would be a mechanized war with very few casualties, and it would be fought out between two sets of kind of mechanics, sort of car repair experts, from Germany on one hand, and from Russian collective farms on the other. Curzio Malaparte also had a lot of sympathies for the Communist Party, and was eventually banned from writing about the war by the German authorities after a year of mistreating the German reputation. So Malaparte thought that it would be a mechanized war, and it was for a long time. It was like a scrap metal war. When the Germans occupied France, they took huge, and they noted down these things, huge sets, groups of abandoned tanks, artillery, aircraft. Prior to that, Europe had been turned into a sculpture park, oddly enough, because when tanks were knocked out in France in 1940, they were left standing where the shells had hit them, and they were places of public resort. People went to them to examine what a tank looked close to, and also to look into the hatches to see if body parts remained in them. So they were a kind of macabre sculpture park. This was the first sort of art aspect of the Second World War. That's in 1940. The Germans attacked, they went into Poland in 1939, and they treated it as a sort of excursion into peasant country. Poles were, in the German understanding, sort of primitive earth tillers of some sort, primitive peasants. And the Germans didn't trouble themselves to photograph. They photographed a lot, but mainly the thing that interested them was the power of the German army, artillery, and dive bombing. And this aspect of a powerful wave of some sort, this is where your phenomenology might come into it, an endemic wave of force took root, certainly in Poland. Poland was bombed flat, or pretty well flat. The next phase was the attack on Russia in 1941. That was, well, it wasn't exactly the next phase. It was seriously delayed. The Germans might have won everything, but for the Balkans, because they had to go into the Balkans for a short while in 1940, 41, in order to subdue uprisings in Yugoslavia and places of that sort. That kept them back from attacking Russia for some months. So that meant that they got into poor weather conditions in front of Moscow. They were at home in the Balkans because they weren't quite at war with the people they were occupying, and they saw them as companionable, friendly, interesting village and townspeople. And it led to a kind of discursive photography amongst the German soldiers. The next phase, of course, was the attack on Russia. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the Germans, why all this German photography? The reason is quite simple, because the Germans were the only people who had cameras. It was a straightforward matter. They made the cameras and they used them. So the Germans attacked Russia with 1.5 million troops. And out of that 1.5 million, perhaps 500,000 had cameras, Zeiss, Icon, all sorts of cameras of that kind, or Rolleiflex and Rolleicords. And they also had a system which was extremely useful for German photographers, a Feldpost, field post system, where they returned their negatives to their homeland, to Mannheim, to Stuttgart, and so on. And they were returned to the front line in 3 weeks' time. It's more or less what you get today, I suppose. A quick turnaround. But that also meant that they could never develop styles, because if you didn't see your pictures printed for a month or two, you had to surmise, you had to guess, and you'd forgotten. So you saw them when they came as letters from your old self, with not the experience that you have nowadays. The other thing I would mention about war photography in the early 1940s is that it's very like letter writing. If you think of letter writing as it was practiced in the 19th, it's seen as part of the history of photography, but that's perhaps not a very accurate way of looking at it. If you go back to letter writing in the 1930s, British letter writing particularly, I read a lot of it, it was impulsive. It was a period before telephones were in great use, and letters, postcards, were written often as in an improvised, broken, kind of dissonant way. They were expressions of personality, and photographs taken by the Germans in Russia in 1941, 42 were like that. They were fragments from experience, and they were sent in a peculiar paradoxical way to oneself later on. So there's a very peculiar timing in the photography I look at. I'll show 40 pictures. The book has something like 500 pictures. I'll show 40 and try to say something about them. This is an introductory picture put in by somebody who was helping me, and he chose this. It's not of my choice, but it's to show the German camera industry, and the other picture I'd used in an introductory piece about ironware, ironmongery, discarded tanks and trucks. They were the principal topics of photography for a short period in 1941. And this scrap was religiously collected and sent back to Germany on trains. And it was also noted in letters to units that they'd captured 800 machine guns last week, 65 staff cars, and 1,800 tanks or something of that sort. So it was, and the great scrap metal opportunity in the war was the famous Battle of Dunkirk, where the British were driven out of northern France. And the British left most of their vehicles behind, and they formed a very picturesque scenes for German photographers, because there's very little action photography in a war. If you're a fighting soldier, you haven't got time to take pictures. The pictures were all taken by people behind the lines. One understands that in an army, 3/4 of the participants are cooks, they're retired school teachers, that sort of thing. They weren't interested in warfare, especially. And when they got to Dunkirk, they photographed the British Army as a sort of scrap metal opportunity. Also, the other thing that enchanted them were sunk ships in the harbors, trawlers, small ships, which had been scuttled, sunk, in other words. And their details, their masts and insignia came out of the water, and they looked like cubist arrangements, cubist sculptures. And the Germans were sensitive to French art and took these almost as a sort of found cubism. So that was how it began. This is the front cover of the book. It's a picture of the Banat, an area, as far as I've been able to identify it, between Romania, Hungary, and a third country whose name I've forgotten, but was filled with German settlers. A lot of German photography had to do with family and relationships and dancing. The camera was the principal object of use in the army, apart from machine guns and so on. The other thing was piano accordions. It was a musical war. And if you wanted to show the desperate nature of war, you showed broken, wrecked piano accordions lying on the road. The great site, the great war site for photography was a place called the Volkhov Pocket, Volkhov, south of Leningrad, which the Germans occupied for year on year. And it was famous for mosquitoes and disease and Russian snipers. They settled there, and they had a cinema and hotels and things like that. And somebody called Gundlach, a German photographer, did a very good book on it. But that was where a lot of the photographic war was fought out. This is a picture that alerted me to the fact that German soldiers weren't kind of ignorant nincompoops, brutal slayers of civilian populations. They were that sometimes, but there were other things too. I looked at this picture. I never knew the names of the photographers. They're anonymous people. I found this in a set taken in the Crimea, and it shows, as you can see, a couple of local people standing, was 3 Germans, probably from an ambulance unit or an armored column or something, or a transport unit, are looking, I think, through their record collection and playing pieces of it. The Ukrainians don't look too happy, and they hold their hands by their sides. And the Germans, again, hold their hands in conspicuous positions. And there's what the British Army called a jerry can, holds petrol, sort of thing you might use to set fire to private properties with. And I realized that what you're dealing with was a sort of Brechtian, a kind of composition. It's a composed picture. It's made up. It's not a natural, intuited, immediate picture. And the reason for that, why should you take a picture of that sort? Because it asks you to intervene and to disentangle or to interpret or to refigure it in your own mind, to see how they've held their hands, where they're standing. It's a sort of imperial and anti-imperial picture. It's a critical picture, but you could get away with it. There was no censorship in the German army because photographs are difficult to censor because you don't know what they're about as a rule. The only people who censored them were the printers back in Germany who developed them and maybe looked at them once or twice before they sent them back to you. So this alerted me to the fact that a certain number of war photographs were staged. They were made up. This man, for example, he chose to work to construct pictures, and I thought, well, how were artists trained in the 1930s? In England, people were trained as artists mainly as illustrators. And if you were trained as an illustrator, it was a great sort of art form of the period until the 1950s. You were trained to imagine scenes, particular kind of set tos, an accident at a level crossing, an accident in a marketplace, something like that. And the other man I knew from that period was an English photographer called Bill Brandt. And Brandt's technique when making photographs was to carry with him a set of clocks and vases and ornaments and pictures, and to put them on mantelpieces and on walls, and to have the candidate sitting in front, and he moved them around. The idea was, it was a sort of technique for taking pictures. The idea was that after 10 minutes of moving a clock on a mantelpiece, the client, the sitter, became so bored that they turned into a kind of new objective face mask, and he then took the picture. But it was a technique of making pictures. And somewhere in Germany in the 1930s, artists, people who ended up in the army, driving trucks or working in provisions or in an office or something like that, got into this habit of asking people like this to move their feet. I want your feet in a certain direction. I saw a lot of these pictures. He'd get a couple of local youths and say, I want you to stand there and have your feet pointing in that direction. The local youths were very intrigued by this and didn't know what it meant. And he took the picture of their faces when they were worrying about if their feet were in the right direction. So it was a kind of an illustrator's tactic. When I look at British pictures of the war, I don't go to photographers or anything. I go to illustrators, drawers, because that's how they were trained. They were trained to notice this sort of thing and to use these sort of tactics. I don't know what this meant. This is a picture he took. I don't know how he got it. A picture he took in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, in 1940, early 41, where a German who either got sore feet or wants to smoke has sat down and has been approached by a local woman to ask him what on earth he thinks he's playing at, what he's doing. And he was an artist who had a kind of an innate gift for selecting like a fence to act as a barrier, somebody watching, different ways of watching. And the whole purpose, I think, of this sort of photography was to involve me, us, the onlooker, in thinking. So you thought it through, so you became part of it. I think you've been talking about Merleau-Ponty recently. It would be something that he would recognize. You internalized you couldn't internalize things just by looking at anything accidentally, but if it was made by someone else, you think, ah, yes, he had or she had an idea, and that's what it was. He liked this. It's terrible because there are hundreds of thousands of these pictures, and you find one person, you'll never be able to find them again if you've forgotten the code number. Where was he? He took pictures like this. This is a sort of Merleau-Ponty business where all the trucks, it involves you in reading and the idea of reading. All the trucks have letters on, K, B, and J, or maybe it's a Sutherland I, I'm not sure. They were probably the names of generals. K might have been Kleist, I don't know. And he thought, ah, yes, a perfect opportunity to sort of double something. This is a phenomenological talk, I suppose. To have a man leading a veiled woman, and we're reading numbers, and he's leading the woman on a horse. It's a kind of, it's like a piece of poetry, a rhyme of some kind, to make you think about your kind of artifacts and the ways in which you think or tell stories. I also found phenomenological photographers. I didn't dare say that in a book, because if you write a book and you mention Derrida or phenomenology or Husserl or Heidegger, which you might very well do, it would lose huge amounts of sales almost immediately. Well, it would. I mean, I'm not kidding. I'm not. But this person was somehow, he'd had some kind of phenomenological training. Again, it would have taken me probably months or years to identify him. The Germans, this is a German motif. They're Maxim quads. The Russians welded these things together and fired them at low-flying aircraft, Stukas and that sort of stuff. But normally they broke down. And the Germans collected them as what they called Schrott, which is rubbish, I think. But they saw them as quaint, old-fashioned, because Maxim guns were pre-Great War. And this one is interesting because it's on a slope. It's a sort of composition with slopes to left, right, upper left, and so on. And it's like an animal that's lost its entrails, because if you had a Maxim quad, you had to repair it ceaselessly. So a toolbox was very necessary. And it's a way of, it's like a weather vane. It's pointing in different directions. Again, this is one of the ways in which these photographers engage themselves and try to engage whoever looked at the picture, probably 3 other colleagues. They weren't big audience photographs. So that's one picture he took. The other pictures he liked to take were of continuities, of people moving across the scene. It was something to do with, I think maybe the last speaker would have said something about this. The being at war was a shock. It involved all sorts of accidents and horrors. And one of the shocks was being at the behest, being guided and inspired by, say, Hitler's talking, vehement radio speeches and that sort of thing. And I think this kind of phenomenological photographer tried to see the war in more kind of like surveyor terms, as made up of movements across landscape, very deliberate and slow movements across landscape. He did quite a lot of pictures like this. This is Germans pausing with, I think, what they call a Schlauchboot, a sort of dinghy for crossing rivers. The other thing he liked to do, the Germans burnt villages regularly, if coming or going. because villages provided shelter for the opposition. But when he showed villages being burned, the village burning would be the signal of catastrophe. Catastrophe, that's a Greek word, isn't it? Yes. Catastrophe on the one hand, and this sort of exercise of counting on the other. He was addicted to the difference between counting slats, fences, which is a patient kind of artisan activity, and a catastrophe in the background of burning. And he showed people, refugees, walking in directions with difficulty, old people pushing things. It was another of his favorites. He took nothing else. Now, I found, it was as if the German army contained Europe's avant-garde from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Jan Dibitz, for example. I found Jan Dibitz photographs taken by horsemen in the German army. And this person, who came from Mannheim, and his name is not known to me, he worked with a Durkup Kleinbild system, where your pictures were printed onto cards and you could rearrange them in any form you liked. But he took long-range pictures. He photographed the entire war. Atrocity. Yes. He took long-range pictures which were difficult to decipher. And that is probably the point, that it's the world at large he's showing. And in it, you have to decipher small, significant things. The important thing about this picture, I think, why he took it, is that the first two prisoners in the column are women. The Germans were fascinated by the Russian army, which included Flintenweiber women, who were usually medical auxiliaries, but they became snipers too, which didn't stand them in good stead, because the Germans had a very strong idea of fair play, and sniping, unless done by Germans, was very much off limits. So they're two women leading a column, but he photographed everything almost out of range, so that you had to use your investigative powers. You became conscious of your investigative powers looking at them. And he liked the idea, I think, he was attracted to the idea of having human activity. It's like this building where we're sitting here looking at these sort of contraptions and things. And at the back, you've got age-old walls built by God knows whom, how long ago. And he liked to make these sort of contrasts between nature as a continuity, as made up of weather systems, and the seasons, against evidence of the German army as an incidental intrusion into it. Hence a sort of picture like this, you think, what on earth is he doing? But it's a windmill, and it's somebody reaping. There again, he asks you to look and to identify the people. There's a German man running the cart. There are Russian or German wounded, we can't tell the difference, and women, Flintenweiber, walking alongside. He asks for decipherment from personal experience in this very broad context of the war and of the rest of the world beyond the horizon. He took violent pictures of torture, at least I think it's torture. They appear to have strung two characters up. This is in the Crimea. The Crimea obviously generates violence, and this is the Crimea on the edge of the sea there. Two men have been tied to a paling, to slats on a wall. But it's difficult to tell what's happening. People are turning away. It's a judgment, it's torture, death probably. Some people want to be involved in it, some don't.